Hey gang, welcome back to another episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. As per usual, I'm your host Neil Seaviews, and today we're diving into another crucial topic that's often overlooked in the realm of data security. And we're going to be joined once again by Terry Ray, Senior Vice President at Imperva. And Terry brings a unique perspective on why organisations need to rethink their approach to what's often considered low-value data. In a world where data is considered the new oil or new gold, it's easy to focus solely on protecting what is perceived as high-valuable information, like personal records. However, Terry is going to shake things up a little bit today because he's going to warn us that criminals are exploiting that very oversight and using overlooked data as a foothold to orchestrate larger, more damaging breaches is something that he's seeing more and more. So from understanding the risks of ignoring such data to exploring strategies for robust data security, this episode promises to be an eye-opener. So whether you're a business leader, a cybersecurity professional, or just keen on understanding the evolving landscape of data protection, you're going to love this one. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Texas, where my man Terry Ray is waiting to join us once again. So a massive warm welcome back to the show. But for anyone that missed our last conversation, can you just remind everyone listening with a little about who you are and what you do?
So my name's Terry Ray. I've been with Imperva, which we do application data security, right? Protecting your data. We're going to talk a lot about that today. I've been with Imperva for about 20 years, really focusing on the data side of business. How do you protect data, all that good stuff. My role at Imperva has changed over the years, being from a sales engineer on the ground, talking to customers and implementing products, all the way to chief technology officer. Today, I'm a field technology officer, and I focus on the strategy that we use to develop data security technologies.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. One of the things I wanted to talk about today around everything data is some of the overlooked data vulnerabilities and some words that people may hear about but not automatically know what they mean. And low-value data, for example, can often serve as a foothold for cybercriminals. So can you expand on that, what low-value data is, and why organisations tend to typically overlook the security of this type of data?
Yeah, low-value data is one of the things that I don't think people spend a lot of time, well, I know people don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but I think a lot of people really don't even understand what it is. And really, it's not any individual name, address, phone number. It's not any individual format of data, if you will. It's essentially data defined as just not important or not important for an organization, important enough for an organization to say, I should do something about this data. And what sets it apart from other data is that other data would be typically the alternative or the antonym to low-value data is regulated data, important data, sensitive data, classified data, PI, whatever type of word or acronym you want to put on data you do think is important, that's the opposite of it. And I think when we look at organizations and the low-value data of it, what we're going to wind up talking about is the definition of it is data that you just don't do anything about. And we'll talk probably more about that as we go into this. But that's really the definition of low-value data is it's just not critical enough to worry about, to mess with. And that's going to come around to bite you in the bottom, I think.
100%. And if we were to zoom out for a moment, given the potential risks associated with all levels of data, and that's where we need to get to. And I appreciate this is a big question, but are there any strategies that you would recommend business leaders and organisations should implement to ensure a more comprehensive data security posture that doesn't discriminate based on perceived value? Because I think that's a trap that many have fallen into in the past.
It is, and it's this multi-layered approach to security. And I don't mean defense in depth. I mean, when I just look in data security and I look at how organizations go about data security today, the overwhelming majority of organizations go through a path, a journey, and that maturity of that journey usually stops. And that's different than it is in any other realm of cybersecurity. In data security, the organizations stop after they have done what regulatory compliance has told them to do. So organizations might come to somebody like me and say, Terry, I need to protect my data. And I say, really, do you want to protect your data? Is that the journey you want to be on? And they say, yes. I said, so how do you want to begin? And they will say, I want to class it. I want to go find where all my data is and my assets are. I want to find out what that is and build that map. I said, okay, that's easy to do. Why do you want to do that? Well, because I want to prioritize. I want to start with my regulated data, and then we'll move from there. And that's the beginning of the creation of low value data. That's the second where someone says, okay, now I've now monitored and I'm securing my regulated data, my sensitive data. It might not be a surprise, but nobody ever gets to that second step, which is the low value data. They say, hey, I'm done. Hands up. I'm finished. The normal Vegas, we clap and rub our hands and show people we don't have anything up our sleeves. I'm done. I walk away from the table. And that's what organizations fail to do. So to answer your question, when you look at how do I protect my low value data, the question is kind of unusual in that really it's about how do I protect my data rather than prioritizing protecting some of my data and not protecting the rest of my data. The answer that you're looking for and the answer that organizations have to ultimately realize is you have to do the same things for your data that you do for your network, that you do for your endpoints, that you do for every other aspect of cybersecurity. Organizations don't say that I have 10 different networks, but I really only care about 3 of them. So I'm not going to put a network firewall on the other 7. Those aren't important networks. I'm just going to provide access control to the 3 networks that are really important to me. Nobody does that. And the same thing is true of all my endpoints. If anybody gets malware or virus in my environment, it starts to impact everyone. So when you have endpoint security, you apply it everywhere. Same thing for identity and everything else. It's just this change in this shift in mindset that happens in data security, where organizations say, let me just protect this one set of data and let me ignore the rest. It's not that they consciously, I think, say, I'm going to ignore the rest. There's a lot of barriers, I think, perceived barriers that they see into it. For example, I'm not going to monitor the rest of my data because data security is expensive. It is expensive. I won't lie about that. It can be expensive. But at the same time, we are already spending all this money on the rest of my environment to do what? Lose my data. And people still lose their data regardless of all their controls because they leave the door wide open to all the rest of this data. In short, the solution to this problem of low value data is don't define data as sensitive. Don't define data as PII or regulated or low value data. Data is data. You have data stored in databases, file servers, big data lakes, et cetera, all across the environment. You need to apply the same controls that you would want to apply only on your private data. Those same controls need to apply across the board, everywhere where you have data. And that includes your development and test environments that, by the way, also very frequently use production data to do development and test. If I'm a bad actor, I know that you're using production data in dev and test. Why would I attack where you probably have your controls when I can attack where you have your, quote, low data or low value data or perceived low value data in environments where I suspect that you probably have significantly less monitoring and visibility if you're doing what most organizations do today rather than what I'm suggesting, which is you need to apply your controls across the board the same way you would if it was all private data.
And many people listening will be wondering, how did we get here? So I'm curious, in your view, from everything that you've seen over the last few years, how has that traditional approach to data classification, how has that contributed to the vulnerability of low-risk data? And are there any other changes that you'd recommend to that framework?
Yeah, so I equate this to the same way men have this. I don't know if it's true or not. It's probably true for me. Yeah, I don't like to go to the hospital. I don't like to go to the doctor. I my arm hurts for a little bit. I'll see if it goes away. It's one of those things we just don't like to go to do that sort of thing. And I think the same thing is true when we think about data security. It's about what is the pain? Do I have enough pain yet to make me go do something? In an organization, the difference between an attack on your website, an attack on your network, an attack on your APIs or your front-end controls usually is very obvious. You know about it pretty rapidly. Things start to break. Things start to no longer work. People no longer have access. You get a virus, it's usually pretty obvious. The exfiltration is pretty loud. That's i.e., the pain is very obvious. The difference in data security is if a bad actor gains access into your databases, your data stores, your file servers, usually they want to be as quiet as possible to maintain that access because the data is constantly new. It's constantly evolving. A credit card that I have today and I start using may well not be good 3 days from now or a week from now. But if I'm still in there, still pulling the data, I can still get new data all the time. I want to reduce that pain. So the difference on the outside of an environment typically is that there's a lot of pain. It's very obvious that you see those types of bad actors happening. On the inside, we see that people don't recognize they even have a breach. Oftentimes for years, I think the average, I saw a statistic recently, it was a Verizon data breach report or something, but the average time to detection of a data theft attack, data breach, is like 277 days. And that's the average. We know that we've got the Yahoos and the others over the years that were 4 years, 7 years in the past that they finally started to recognize that these things happen. And a lot of organizations don't recognize that these even happen until there's an actual bug bounty that comes to them and someone says, hey, by the way, I stole 1 million of your records. You want to pay me some money? And I'll tell you how I did it. So at the end of the day, when we start to look at what has caused all this, organizations, the security teams in organizations almost never have a database administrator or more importantly, a database security expert on those teams that can tell them what I'm telling them now. And you can prove this by going to LinkedIn and do a search in quotes and say network security. And you're going to find about 1.5 million people that claim to know network security. Do the same thing for database security. You're going to find 36,000 people, roughly, maybe it's changed since I last checked, but 36,000 people that claim to be database security experts, even fewer that claim to be file security experts. You just don't have these people on your team. So it's no surprise that organizations try to do the best that they can, and they tend to do just what they've been told to do, which is PCI told me to do this, SOX told me to do that, GDPR told me to do this, NES told me to do that. Right? So whatever the regulation happens to be, typically they're just simply doing what they're told to do, not what they've learned throughout their career and what they've learned through education. Certainly this isn't taught in colleges. So I understand why the gap exists. It's a skills gap. It's an expertise and knowledge gap. It could be a budget gap too, I suppose, but it's a gap that we have to overcome. Otherwise, you spend all this money to secure the environment, and yet you still have a breach. And this is the question that boards ask all the time. Why did we still have a breach? Don't we spend all of this money on this stuff? Yeah, we still had a breach, but it wasn't in an area that was sensitive or secure or important for us. We were surprised to see the data over there. And that's what we continue to run into over and over and over again. And hopefully at some point, organizations start to figure it out. You have to do the same thing in data that you do for networks and endpoints. You've got to cover it all.
Such a good point there. And one of the other reasons I wanted to get you back on the podcast was I was reading how you were saying that it's critical for organizations to monitor low-risk data as intensely as high-risk data, which feels like a real game-changer moment. So can you expand on that? And also some of the challenge that listeners might face in trying to do just that too.
Yeah, at this point, what we're looking at is we're looking at organizations. Certainly, if you're a new organization, this doesn't apply to you. I mean, the statement I'm about to make, everything I've said applies to you, but the statement I'm about to make certainly doesn't. But a lot of organizations have been in business for years, decades, multiple decades, whatever. The older the organization, the more likely that they have collected vast amounts of data. That when they collected that data, it just wasn't all that important to them. Data security certainly wasn't important to them. So in those cases, what they have is they have a catch-up game that they have to deal with. They've got to really begin this process of saying, okay, we have potentially petabytes of data that we've stored over the years in all of these different data stores across the environment. And now you're telling me I need to now go spend all of this time, spend all of this money and all of this effort to go back to all of these data stores and now apply security to it. That's not the same case that when we start to think about, well, I have laptops. We've been dealing with antivirus and anti-malware stuff for years. So this is just incremental on top of whatever they're growing with. The same thing is true of networks. Everybody's had networks network security since the early 90s, late 80s, that sort of thing. And so when we think about data security, we're starting at this point where organizations have this huge hill to climb, where they feel like they have this huge hill to climb to say, you want me to cover everything, all of these data stores and do it all at once? Well, yeah, in a perfect world, you kind of want to get this security on there as quickly as possible. We don't live in a perfect world. So, yeah, certainly I understand, right? If you've got 100 databases, you can do this really quickly. It's really easy to do. If you're a top 10 financial services organization in the world, then you have 20 to 30 to 40,000 databases. You're not going to do this on a Saturday morning. This is going to take you some time to get there. What I would say to these organizations is you have to have a plan, you have to have a program, and you have to adhere to the program with the goal of, you need to get to covering all of that data. Any data that you have that is uncovered, I promise you, it will be found at some point. It will be found. There's plenty of automated tools out there that allow bad actors and others to find the weakest point in an organization. And if they're inside your network, they're already, in many cases, at one of your weakest points, the internal of the environment. Now they're looking for the vulnerabilities and exploits that aren't being taken care of on any data source that you have, and they will find it. It's actually pretty easy to find. And so they're going to find that, and they're going to exploit it, and they're going to use that as that jumping off point. Now, usually, I'll give you a couple of examples, a couple of stories here, or I'll give you one here real quick. When I give you an example of low-value data, certainly a credit card is not low-value data. Almost everybody will do their best to protect credit cards. Names, addresses, phone numbers. Yes, that's private information. That's low-hanging fruit. All that's great stuff. Think about, and I've got an organization that did this, I won't tell you where, but an organization that recognized they had vulnerabilities happening here. They had someone going in and changing a year of a prison sentence. The Department of Justice, if you will, or the Department of Prisons has websites, and those websites are used internally to put in inmates' information and how many years they have as a sentence, and then that decreases over time. What they found is they had organizations, or in this case, DBAs, that were going in and manipulating that year because they were being paid to do so, to change the years that someone served in prison. Now, they can't sell that necessarily. I mean, they can't sell the year, but selling the ability to change that year, they were getting paid about $250,000 to change that time period so someone didn't have to stay in jail as long as they were supposed to. You start to think about, is a year sensitive data? It's not sensitive. It's not regulated. It's not considered private information. It's not even identifiable unless you put it with something else. But it's highly monetizable if somebody knows how to use it and do something with it. And that's what I'm talking about here. One of the other ways we think about low-value data is the data you need to think about as an organization of how other people can monetize the information that you have, and are you looking at it?
Just to further bring to life everything that we're talking about here, and maybe hammer home the importance of protecting low-value data, are there any other insights or maybe examples you could share where insufficient attention to low-value data has led to significant breaches, and maybe some of the lessons that organisations and people listening can learn from those incidents so they don't end up repeating them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hesitate to name a lot of organizations because some of them, after their breach, obviously become customers of mine. But I can tell you, look, it was so public out there, and it was a couple of years ago. I use Yahoo as the example, not because they're unlike any of the other organizations that I would otherwise name, just because it's clearly public information. But they came back and said, look, we've lost 3 billion users. So clearly they had a lot of users, but it took them 4 years to be able to say, oh man, we had a breach. We found this hole. It took them another 3 years to try and do something about it. And then a year later, after the initial breach, they recognized they had yet another breach in 2014. And so we're going back a few years. The point is that any organization that's out there that loses data, almost always what we're looking at, and I say almost always, there's some exceptions, but almost always they're finding this information after the fact, days, weeks, or months later. And even when they come to me and say, Terry, we've had a breach, we've had an exposure, we've identified it, it's very rare that these organizations are the ones themselves who actually identified the breach. I would say greater than 90% of the time, and this was actually a studied metric a bit ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago, a studied metric where it was, I think the number was 94% of organizations, in fact, did not detect their own breach. Someone else, a federal law enforcement, a bug bounty, a customer, someone else had to come back and say, your data is on the dark web, your data is being stolen, or my data, Terry Ray, my data has been stolen. It looks like it's only data from your environment. Someone else had to tell them. They're completely unable to detect that they've had their own breach. And then they do the investigation, and then they find a hole. I think the consequences of this is, okay, I found where the data exists that has been taken. The challenge that organizations have is in doing that incident response, they dig into it and they start to say, where else do we have this data? How else could this user have gotten in? What else could this user have done? And it becomes very difficult for these organizations to feel confident that they've actually identified every place where a user internally could have gone, because they're so blind at the data layer. It's easy for them to identify, did they come through the network? Sure, they did. Did they go through an application? Sure. Did they use introduce malware on a specific endpoint? Yes. And where did they go from there? But once they get into the data tier, this data tier is typically it's a lot like a flashlight in a dark room. I can only see where I've pointed the flashlight, and they only point the flashlight at their critical data. Everywhere else where that user might have gone, there's no logs, there's no history, there's no trail, so there's no knowledge. You just don't know. And I think a good example of that is when you see these breaches that come out. It's very rare that you see a breach notification where someone says, oh, we lost 10,231 records. Usually they say we lost 15,000 records, 20,000 records, 1 million records, whatever it is. And the reason for that in many cases is the organization had to do breach notification. They know they hadn't. And then someone came back, a regulator came back to them and said, okay, we appreciate you letting us know that you had that breach. Now, how many records were actually taken? And the short answer is, we don't know. We don't know how many were taken. We just know that we know what we see out here, but we don't know what the actual breach was. All right, well, the follow-up question to that from every regulator out there is, if you don't know how many records were taken, how many records do you have? And they'll say, we've got 2 million records, 3 billion records. All right, well, if you can't tell me it was 3, 5, 10, or 1,000, then we have to go with the worst case scenario, and your number is whatever, 3 billion records. In some countries, you have to send a physical letter to let someone know that their record has been breached. A physical letter in the States, at least, is 50 cents per letter. So if you lose 1 million records, it just costs you $500,000 to just send the letters, much less anything else that happens. So you want to be really sure that you know how many records were actually taken and be able to prove that. So if nothing else, you can reduce the mail that you have to send out. That's an immediate indirect fine that you have of everything happening, much less the actual fine that's going to come and the fallout and the brand and all the other things that happen from this breach. But this is, or organizations, what they can do about it is they have to have visibility. You can't secure anything if you're not looking at it. And that's the case in everything. You close your eyes, you're going to get hit. Take the Star Wars model. If you put the blast shield down and you try to block the little laser beam with your lightsaber, you're probably going to miss it unless you're a Jedi. And I don't think any of us are. That's my nerd hat coming out. Sorry for that, but that's where it is.
No apologies needed. This is a tech podcast after all. And of course, balancing security and accessibility, that is almost an episode completely on its own. So anything else you can advise on how companies can balance that need for data accessibility with the imperative of security, especially when it comes to data that is frequently used or even deemed less sensitive?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting in this space for data security. Unlike network security and even endpoint security, DLP and some of those, where one of the first things out of somebody's mouth is how quickly can you block bad behavior, there are users of technologies like ours and others that do ask about blocking. And I think you should block in this space. There are absolutely factors for when you should and when you should not block around bad and unusual behavior happening here. That said, most organizations in this space of data security, in the realm of data security, honestly prefer not to block at first. They prefer, just let me know what's going on. Tell me when Terry accesses more records than he normally does. Tell me when Terry accesses more records than his peers normally do, or my applications or APIs normally do of a certain kind of data. Just help me understand the usage of the data and give me an alert so I can take action, even if it's not immediate action, because this data, my data tier is hypercritical to my organization. I don't have, I being the user of the technology, I don't have the expertise to know what to block and what not to block yet. So they tiptoe into it a little bit, but they begin with, at least let me monitor this, at least let me analyze the data that I'm monitoring through whatever means, machine learning or algorithms or whatever you want to do, but let me analyze the data and bubble the unusual behavior to the top. That's the low-hanging fruit. That's what most organizations begin with. But that maturity model that they need to go through, ultimately, the successful organizations that leverage this technology, the takeaway here is just don't stop. You have to continue the path, the journey. You're not done once you start logging or once you start collecting information about what's going on. You need to have that threat detection. You need to understand the risks associated with those threats. And this is the maturity that you go through this type of technology. And lastly, or along that journey, you're going to find things that you don't want to have happen again. And that's where you start to say, all right, well, I know exactly what this is, this behavior. Let's make sure we put some controls in place to allow the data access, allow the people that are supposed to do this behavior to do it. But maybe I want to have a workflow before they go to it. I have a DBA. He needs to access 1 million records. He's not going to look at them. He's not going to read them, but part of his job requires him to do it. So I'm just going to change his job a little bit. And now for him to do that 1 million record access, he needs to go to a CMDB, a ServiceNow or whatever. He needs to say, I need to access 1 million records. It comes back and says, why? Because it's part of my job for these reasons. Great. Here's your ticket ID. You have approval to do this for this amount of time. Now go access your records. Now there's a checks and balance. Now there's an actual change ticket reconciliation. And I can go back from a regulatory compliance perspective and say, Terry needed to access 1 million records. He got approval from appropriate management. Here's the ticket ID. Here's the log of it. And yes, he went and did it. And everything's done. It requires a little bit of a change of process to do it right. But that's the world we live in when you've already decided to collect all of this data, and now we're going backwards and starting to secure it rather than securing it as we should have all along. That's just part of the process. We've got to kind of rewind a little bit and start to break some of these, carte blanche access that we have and kind of build a little more security into them.
And I think we're in a moment of economic uncertainty on both sides of the pond. And I think every tech project now is very often only getting stamped based on its business value that it delivers, the ROI it will deliver. So when we're looking at things like security investment justification, how can IT leaders justify the investment in securing things like low-value data to stakeholders who may be more focused on cost than comprehensive security? Because, again, it's something we hear about time and time again, isn't it?
Yeah, if the technology to solve these problems was free and it only took half a head count to do it for an environment of thousands of databases, I think everybody would be doing it, right? It's one of these things that when you ask somebody, when you ask an audience to raise your hand if you think data security is important, everybody raises their hand. When you ask people what are their top 3 priorities of securing their environment of security, data is usually one of those top 3. So it is this disconnect of, okay, everybody agrees it's important. How do we get people and organizations over the hump to treat this the same way they have done for everything else? And I think this is one of those things where it comes down to evidence and education. As I said earlier, you just don't have a lot of data security experts that sit in security teams in a lot of organizations. And I know there's a lot of security CISOs and others that are listening to this podcast, and consider for yourself, right? Do you have database security experts on your team? I'm going to say you probably don't. And if you do, they need to update their LinkedIn at least. But it's one of these things where there is a skills gap. There is this knowledge gap of, am I doing the right thing? Am I not doing the right thing? And I think it's beholden on even us as some of the vendors to be able to provide more information back to the organizations, which to be fair, we haven't done in the past, to be able to tell them, you have X number of databases. Today, some percentage of them are currently monitored with technology, and you're doing you're 75% there in terms of the security configuration that you need on that small percentage that you got protected. It needs to be called out that the other 70% of your environment that's been discovered is in fact not monitored. It's not encrypted. It has no controls associated with it. And therefore, your risk of a data breach is significantly higher than your next closest peer or your peers in the region. This is work that still needs to be done in vendors like ourselves and others. We're well aware of it, and we're on a path there to be able to provide that data. But I think it's this collaboration between vendors and the security teams themselves to be able to provide evidence up to executives and those that are making the decisions for budgets to say, why wouldn't I go apply more budget to my data? Well, here's the reason why. You think you're done because you passed your PCI audit. You think you're done because you passed your GDPR audit. That is not security. And that's the other question I can ask a whole room of people. Is compliance the same as security? And everybody will agree that compliance is not the same as security. So it's about getting them over that hump, putting it in front of their face and saying, you've done compliance. Great. That's a great checkbox. You're off to the races. Now let's turn your compliance into actual security for the organization. And it's going to be more of an educational thing. It's not a lack of technology. It's a lack of education and evidence that needs to be passed to executive management.
And if we look to the future for the moment as we reach the end of this podcast, especially as cyber threats continue to evolve, any advice on how organizations should maybe adapt their data security strategies to protect all levels of data? And also maybe leave us with something about the role that you see Imperva playing in supporting this evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to beat a dead horse, if you will, right? But I think what organizations have to do as we look to the future is prioritize data security above where they already have more. Meaning, I see a lot of organizations out there that will say, some of my priorities this year are upgrading my firewall, upgrading this and upgrading that. And there's no question that those are important. But you have to start to think about, is upgrading my firewall as important as putting some level of visibility in an environment where I know that I have absolutely zero visibility and security? There's this gaping open wound that you have that needs some level of triage on it, yet we're still worried about the ouchie where I need a Band-Aid. And I think we have to forget about the ouchie and worry about this gaping open wound that has to be taken care of, because the wound is what's going to kill you. The ouchie is not going to cause you that big of an issue. So I think it's about prioritization. As we look to the future, organizations have to start to say, this is a massive gap that I have, and I know that I've ignored it for years and years. It's time to start to close that gap. And there's knowledge, there's expertise, there's a lot of work to be done. I think that's the biggest barrier organizations get to, and it's not perceived as easy because nobody on the team has actually done it. It's hard for the team to give them a path. Imperva is going down this journey to be able to provide them that path. So Imperva's journey on this has always been, let's make sure we can cover the environment as a whole. That means scale, that means capability, to be able to give an organization the ability to have that full visibility, but do it in a very small footprint, do it on-prem and in the cloud, not just one or the other, but more importantly, be able to do something with that data. Once we've collected all of your data, now that volume and variety of data and veracity of data that you see in big data and data science, let's put that into machine learning. Let's put that into AI, and let's do something with that data to boil out and distill out, if you will, those bad behaviors. And this next journey for Imperva is now to say, all right, organization, you've done a little bit. Let me tell you everything you haven't done. Let me put it front and forward. This is all the work you have left to do. You've done some good stuff, and I'm going to score you on what you've done, good, bad, or otherwise. And where you've done nothing, we're going to highlight it really nice and red for you and say, look, this is stuff that really needs to be focused on. And here's what you can do every Monday. Here's the plan you can go about. Let's reduce your risk week after week so that by the end of a year, by the end of a quarter, by the end of a half of a year, you can recognize that your risk has been reduced from whatever it was at the beginning of the year to where it is today, and you can start to show evidence, back to that evidential phase, show evidence that what you're doing is working. You're on a journey, you're on a path, and there's a timeline that gets you to complete security in data. And that's our journey. That's where we're going with this, is to try and help organizations close that knowledge gap by leveraging our own expertise there to help them move this journey forward.
Fantastic advice. And before I let you go, I'm conscious we've talked about a very serious matter today, but I suspect that while you've been out in the field, you've picked up a few amusing or interesting stories along the way. So before I let you go, are there any funny or interesting stories that have happened in your career that you can leave us with today? And we'll finish on a light-hearted note.
There are plenty, some of which you can talk about, some of which you can't, right? To me, the one that I get a chuckle out of each time we talk about it, and I think it's appropriate for today, is one of our users years ago. They had been using our technology for about 3 years, and they operate a string of toll roads around the United States. So, they track license plate numbers and lots of things as people go through the different toll booths and that sort of stuff. And we brought out some machine learning about 10 years ago or whatnot to look through all of their logs. And they'd found some interesting stuff over the years, but they wanted to see what they might have missed doing it manually versus that machine learning would do. So we dumped all of their data into the machine learning, and the machine learning spit out some information. And what it spit out is they found that they actually had some DBAs. And these DBAs were accessing their data in a way that DBAs weren't supposed to. And in fact, DBAs were accessing data that only an application that federal law enforcement, Homeland Security, and others were supposed to access. But the funny part of this is they weren't doing it to be malicious. They weren't doing it to make money. They weren't doing it for any other reason except to find out if, in this very specific case, to find out if their wives were actually going where their wives told them to. I said I was going to the mall. Well, I can track you going to the mall from the toll booth. And that's the only reason why they were doing it. And that's the interesting thing that I find about that. And the funny thing is that you're going to find that organizations have data, and there's a lot of different reasons why people will use it, even to the degree that someone might just use it to say, oh, well, you said you were going here, but you didn't. That's very interesting to me. And so to me, that's the case. And while that might not be the funniest thing that's happened to me, it's the only thing I can maybe talk about in mixed company, if you will. So to me, that's the interesting one. And the funny one is recognize that it's not always about malicious bad behavior. It might be just opportunistic behavior for somebody to do something they want to do with it.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you back on the podcast today. We even had time for a few laps there. For anyone listening, just want to find out more information about Imperva, where would you like to point everyone listening?
Like always, the easiest way is directly to www.imperva.com. Head over there. We've got all kinds of updated stuff, and certainly links to a podcast like this one.
Well, there's some big takeaways from our conversation today, such as how not protecting low-value data is pretty much like leaving your front door wide open, and also exploring why organizations need to monitor low-risk data just as intensely as high-risk. We covered all that and even had time for a few laughs, but just a big thank you once again, Terry, for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Neil. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
And that wraps up another insightful episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. So a huge thank you to Terry Ray from Imperva for joining us again today and shedding light on the often underestimated value of what's deemed as low-risk data. And for me, I think his insights reminded me that in the realm of cybersecurity, it's complacency that can be our biggest enemy, and vigilance our strongest ally. And we did cover a lot of ground today, from the pitfalls of ignoring certain types of data to the strategies needed to keep our digital assets safe. But for everyone listening, let me know if you've got anything that you would like to add to the conversation. Techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC.Hughes. Let's keep this conversation going. But that's it. I've taken up far too much of your time, but I will be back again bright and early tomorrow. So thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.